Twisted Christian. Today I'm going to be discussing it's not just happening in Iraq, but this is happening all over the world. There is a global wave of protest, and I'm going to go over just a couple articles so I can show you guys what is going on, and possibly is this the break, part of the break in the system, since we know it's just not going on in Iraq. But before we get into that, I'd like to thank you guys for your support on the Patreon. If you guys like my videos, go ahead and give us support, because not only that, you support the projects, the animation and comic projects that we have on there. At the end of the video, it will pop up. The link to the Patreon will pop up too as well. The link is also down below in the description. Before we get into the main topic, there's something that is quite disturbing. And this is what I've been saying all along, that the Federal Reserve has been pumping and pumping, $87 billion here, $120-something billion there, another $50 billion there, and they've been doing it over the last few months. And so something is not right, something is wrong. Some people that are in the industry are shocked about what's going on. But see, the average person is not going to know. So I'm just going to read a little bit of this article. Because it looks like the Federal Reserve just pumped another $500 billion into the market, I guess, to avoid the year-end repo crisis. So massive, huge, largest ever. Fed will flood market with gargantuan $500 billion in liquidity to avoid year-end repo crisis. So there is something going on. In previewing today's Fed statement regarding repurchase operations on Tuesday, Curvature Securities repo expert Scott Skyrim said that he expects the Fed to announce a $50 billion at least term operation for Monday, December 23rd, which is double the current term ops, and then a $50 billion at least term operation for Monday, December 30th. This prediction was in response to Zoltan Pozar's warning that Federal Reserve levels are too low, and the result would be a market crash that could spark in QE4. Well, moments ago, the New York Fed did publish its latest weekly statement regarding repurchase operations, as expected, laying out the Fed's expected repo operations for the period December 13th through January 14th, and it blew Skyrim's expectations out of the water. So here we go again. The central bank has all this money. They can just pour however much money they want into certain things. One of the things that I find interesting is that, we say, all these projects that would help the poor, or, we don't have enough money for schools, we don't have enough money for this or that, whatever the project is, but yet the central bank just seems to toss around money like it's nothing. So I find that interesting, but I think we should be, this is part of the warning, this is part of what's going on, this is part of the whole thing, what's going on with the Federal Reserve System and the central banking system. Yeah, so this all has to do with the central banking system and what's going on, and just some of the problems that are out there. I don't understand everything, but according to, people who know about this stuff, this is not really a good sign. All right, and that's where this whole thing that's part of the debt and part of the central banking, the Federal Reserve System, what they're doing, and is this going to lead to a market crash? Everything that we've been discussing on this channel and other channels, it seems like it's just right there in front of our eyes. And of course, the central bankers are like saying, don't worry about it. We got everything covered. There's no way that you're going to the world is going to be able to pay off $250 trillion worth of debt. It's too much. It's too big. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on to the main topic. And I'm just going to show you a headline from one article. This is coming from the Wall Street Journal. Global wave of protests rattle governments. Right? Okay, so we already know that Iraq is involved in this, but the whole point is that we're getting ready to get into. It's just not happening. You're hearing about certain things in the media, but they're not telling you anything, because if you put all the pieces together, if you put what's happening, what I'm getting ready to go over, this could be part of the break in the system where people have had enough, right? And they have to do something. And the only way that you're going to be able to really solve a lot of these issues is to raise the value of those countries that should be where they are at anyway, right? You're not going to lift people out of poverty. What these people want, they want to be able to lift people out of poverty over time, but the system has not worked. Everything that they're doing has not worked. There's not enough money, there's not enough taxes that they can bring in to make the system work. Not just in Iraq, and this be the break in the system. This is part of the break in the system, because I think a break in the system and things happen suddenly, it's the pressure is just going to be so much that it's just going to break when things seem at their worst, right? And the only reason why we're not really seeing it here is because here in the United States, nobody's protesting about anything, despite all the inequality in this country, especially when it comes to the finances, because most of these protests have to do with inequality, no jobs, and poor wages. Well, we do have, even here in the United States, yes, it's not as bad. Every 2 years and every 4 years, we have all these politicians saying they want to do this, they want to do that for the schools. Nothing is being done. This country is $23 trillion in debt, and yet the school system isn't better. The roads aren't any better. Quality of life isn't better. It's better for a certain percentage of people who already have a lot. And I'm getting ready to show you here there's a big wealth gap, and is the big wealth gap a contributing factor to all these protests? And that's what's going on in Iraq. It's not just about the wealth gap, but it's also about the corruption, and you're about to see that here. This year was marked by global unrest. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get into this news article by ABC. This year was marked by global unrest, and 2020 is likely to be worse. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and go through this article very quickly and make comments on it as I go through. This year may very well go down as the most disrupted year in global politics since the fall of Berlin Wall in 1989 and subsequent implosion of the former Soviet Union. However, the likelihood is that 2020 will be worse and bloodier. Conditions that spawned global unrest on every continent in 2019 are unlikely to recede, which means they're not going to stop. Rather, they are likely to worsen in the face of a slowing global economy and little sign of causes of disaffecting being addressed. All right, now they're calling Washington as disruptor. So what we're going to do is, before we get into this, we're going to add a Trump effect, right, to all of this, because a lot of these things that are happening worldwide, we're pulling out of certain war zones. We're not supporting and giving a lot of our billions of dollars away to other countries that should be contributing more in a lot of different areas. According to this, they said because a lot of what he's doing is disrupting what they had in place. They had their honeypot, they had their cookie jar. The central banking system and all these governments had all these powerful and rich people had all their hands in the cookie jars, and the system can no longer work, and the people are tired of waiting for politicians to actually do what they say they're going to do. In a word, the world is a mess, made more threatening by the retreat of the Trump administration from America's traditional role as a stabilizing force. Yeah, we can't go in and do everything. We can't go in and we keep sending our troops in, and then it's mostly our troops that die. And then yet they expect the United States to basically fund everything. And I think we've come to a point where we're not going to be doing that anymore. And I think that's good overall. If anything, Washington is a disruptor in its abandonment of international agreements. These include the Paris Agreement on climate change and the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. The U.S. has also withdrawn from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that froze Iran's nuclear ambitions. Washington's defenestration of the JCPOA and its reposition of tough sanctions on Iran has further destabilized the world's most volatile region. Well, that's because they're not doing what they're going to do. Iran is just going to continue to do what it's going to do, regardless if the sanctions are strong or weak. They're going to do the exact same thing. It's just a matter of time before something happens in there where there's some type of change. All this and more, including an unresolved trade conflict between the U.S. and China, virtually guarantees 2020 will stretch out the sinews of a fragile global order. That's amazing that, one country can change everything. So obviously it wasn't that stable to begin with. An evolving U.S.-China technology war and risk of technological decoupling add to the gloom. The world is in worse shape than during the GFC. The global financial crisis of 2007-8 was a period of intense uncertainty as global financial system buckled, but for the most part that distress was confined to governments, boardrooms, and the offices of international lending institutions. The global financial crisis did not fuel widespread global unrest as a shell-shocked financial world came to terms with the reality of a regulatory framework that had failed. 2019, the story shifted dramatically. Mass protests over the skewed benefits of globalization, accompanied by faltering confidence in a democratic model, are challenging to the assumptions on which a Western liberal capitalist system has rested. Local grievances are fueling protests against an established order in places as far as in Bolivia, Beirut. Endemic corruption is looming larger. If there is a defining issue that is driving the popular unrest more or less across the board, it is that people do not feel like they are sharing the benefits of this extended period of global economic expansion. That's right, because when they were expanding and they were bringing in more and more oil, what happened to all the money? What happened to all those billions and billions and billions of dollars? What happened to all the money, all the billions of dollars they brought in from the auctions? Where's all that money? They had so much money. I guarantee that they could have made every citizen of Iraq a millionaire. It's absolutely ridiculous with all the money that's just poured into Iraq since 2003. In January, Oxfam reported that the world's 26th richest individual owned as much as wealth as the poorest half of the global population. Now tell me, people, if you sat in a room with 26 people, I mean, just imagine that, where you have around 26 people at your job or, wherever the case, imagine that. 26 people have more money than half of the world. That's absolutely insane. And that is the part of what is driving this. And then you got to think about it. Those are just the individuals. We're not even looking at the families. You're looking at families who have, they have like family trust and all that stuff. And the money's just shared among the whole entire family. Imagine some of the wealthiest families that have been around for hundreds of years. So not even including that, the world's richest families. Billionaires grew their combined fortunes of $2.5 billion a day in 2018, while the relative wealth of the world's poorest $3.8 billion declined by $500 million a day. A rich-poor gap is widening across the world to a point where it is no longer possible to argue that an economic growth model that advantages the few is lifting all boats. And that could be very true. And we see that at least here in the United States, that taxes continue to go up, but wages rise really slow, and everything is getting more and more expensive. I mean, heck, it's almost just as cheap sometimes to go out and go get you a cheap $5 meal than it is to actually make that meal at home and use your stove and your microwave and all that stuff. It's getting to be pretty crazy. Now, and that's the whole thing about inequality, right? And that's why we invest the way that we invest, so that we can become more equal, and that we can do what God has set us to do, and we can also use our wealth to live the life that God intended us to have, and also to help others too as well. In the system that we're on does not, it can be very beneficial to you, or the system could hurt you. Professor Carey of Georgia State acknowledges differences and causes of localized unrest now sweeping the world, but he also identifies shared characteristics. He writes, each protest in this worldwide wave has its own local dynamic and cause, but they also share certain characteristics. Fed up with rising inequality, corruption, slow economic growth, angry citizens worldwide are demanding the end of corruption and the restoration of the democratic law, the rule of law. Here in the United States, the media kind of shelters, unless we're looking at alternative news, the media kind of shelters us from all these other things that are going on in the world. So we don't know, most Americans don't know on a daily basis what's actually going on. And we haven't even got to the real interesting parts yet. Carey makes the most useful point that as the world becomes more urbanized, overcrowded cities are staging points in global wave of unrest. In 1950, there were only 2 megacities with populations of 10 million or more. Today, there are 25 such megacities. Of a world population of 7.7 billion, 4.2 billion, or 55% live in cities and other urban settlements. Another 2.5 billion will move into poor countries by 2050. In other words, poverty, gang crime, drug trafficking, and all the other ills associated with an impoverished urban environment will become less manageable as overcrowding gets worse in cities, parts of which have become urban slums. Kerry writes, ignored by municipal government, overcrowded urban settlements usually lack sanitation, clean drinking water, electricity, healthcare facilities, and schools. The injustices of this daily life underlie the anger of many of today's protesters. From Critcho to Beirut, extreme marginalism of so many people living in big dysfunctional and dangerous places has boiled over into daily unrest. In these circumstances, it's no accident that Latin America, the world's slowest economic growth and most glaring inequality, has exploded in the longest lasting violent protest. So people all over the world are fed up. I guess here in the United States, we're not fed up. We're not fed up enough. The people that live in, say, like Chicago, I mean, it's been run by the same party for over 50 years. And yet, Chicago is like super bad, and people are leaving Chicago, and I feel sorry for the people who are stuck there, who actually live like in really bad areas, in slum areas. And yes, we all make our individual choices, but when you're born into a situation like that, and you're raised in a situation like that, and you don't know anything else but that, and that cycle is continued on, and all you get is all these things that politicians say and what they're going to try to do to break that cycle, and yet nothing happens. It's the same cycle as it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. All right, so we're going to get into all these individual countries that are having problems, right? So in Chile, where economic grievances boiled over into days of mass protests, and the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit was abandoned because of security concerns. In Bolivia, the longest-serving populist, President Morales, was forced out of office in the country by days of urban unrest. In Haiti, protests over corruption, lack of unemployment, extreme poverty has paralyzed the functioning of the state for months. In countries like Ecuador, Peru, Venezuela, unrest is barely contained in the face of endemic corruption and government failures to provide basic services. Middle East, it's the same story. Lebanon, riven by protests for months. The Prime Minister was forced to step down amid growing anger about rising living costs, lack of job opportunities, stagnant wages, and corruption. Of course, they talk about Iraq. We already know what's going on there. In Iran, days of protest over economic austerity were put down brutally by a regime that is battling crippling sanctions. The Egyptian regime is under immense pressure from an exploding and impoverished population. Jordan has witnessed its own protests recently over economic hardship. Libya is riven by a civil war that is both driving and facilitating an asylum seeker exodus across the Mediterranean to Italy. This in turn fueling an anti-immigration tensions in that country. In France, mass protests over their president attempts to address that country's economic malaise show sign of little easing, whatever that's supposed to mean. I guess it's the economy is not supposed to be doing well, but they try to dress it up, or to the point where you can't understand it. And those have been going on for a long time, folks. What's going on in France has been going on for a long time, and they're not giving up. In Europe, unrest is barely contained. Spain, tens of thousands Catalan independent protesters have taken to the streets of Barcelona to attend standoff with Madrid. In Russia, demonstrations against official corruption have been a feature, as they've been elsewhere in the former Soviet Union. In Eastern Europe, authoritarian regimes such as those in Poland and Hungary carry within their seeds of confrontation with the disaffected population. In Africa, all the ills mentioned above are present in spades. So in Africa, all this stuff is happening all over Africa, right? Is basically what they're saying. South Africa is struggling to cope with huge economic challenges posed by an influx of refugees and a vast underclass camped in townships on the fringe of its major cities. In Hong Kong, a proposed extradition law that would have facilitated the removal of those accused of crimes or misdemeanors to the mainland might have prompted mass protests, but at the heart of the demonstrations are economic grievances. Hong Kong's wealth disparities are obscene. Okay, now they talking about they go into climate arrest. Climate change isn't really something. Anyways, so as we go back, there's these countries all over the world, and they're experiencing similar things to Iraq, and yet a lot of these they're not giving up. They haven't, even you would think in Western style protests, you think, okay, people protest for a few days and they go home, right? I mean, that's what we always do, right? I mean, we protest and then we go home. But here, they stay. That's the difference. That's why nothing ever changes here, because there might be something that happens and then people go out and protest for a couple days, but then nothing changes. Politicians come out and they say, oh, we need to calm things down, we need to settle things down, we need to work things out, we need to pass laws doing this and that, and they never do anything. But they're saying 2020 is likely to be worse, right? Because people are not giving up wherever they are doing these protests because of the inequality and of the corruption. So as we look at the events, the protests now, change now, and that's what a lot of these people want in these countries. They want change now. They want economic growth now. They need jobs now. They don't have wait for politicians to talk about, well, we need time to do these things. And that's, mainly in Iraq they're really doing that, and other places. And some of these protests are not giving up until they get change. So you have all these global events that are happening at the same time, and at some point it's going to have to come to a point to where either something has to change, right? They're all going to come to a point to where something has to change, because if they start doing it in this country where people are out every single day, that would be huge. But most of us have to go to a job, and they're not going to be out there protesting about all the corruption and all that stuff. We do it online, but see, that's the whole thing. Politicians don't care. They put out their statements, they say they're going to make changes, and then we go back home. With everything that's going on with social media, people don't care. Oh, they're raising all their taxes on us. Man, what they've done in our state in the last 6 months, they've raised taxes on everything that you can about think of. Sales tax, tax on trading in your car, taxes on your DMV fees. Everything has gone up. Income tax gone up. But the same very people, it's funny, the same very people that put those people in office are the same people that are complaining about all the taxes, but yet they don't see that the people that they voted for are doing the same thing, and then somehow the President of the United States is somehow responsible. Anyways, folks, like I said, it's not just happening in Iraq. This is happening all over the world. So will we see, is this when things seem at their worst, is this just in Iraq, or is it all over the world? It still could be just Iraq, because Iraq could be the trigger, right? If things get so bad, they're just like, okay, we got to do this. We got to lift the value now. And then it triggers everything else. Even though there is other protests that aren't as bad and everything, will Iraq just be the trigger? I apply when things seem at their worst, because I focus on Iraq. And if it's super bad there, then of course in other places, yes, it's going to, and according to this article that we were reading, that it's only going to get worse. So we haven't reached that point yet when things seem they're at their worst. So we have a sudden change, a break in the system. These protests might be one of the things on top of, so you have all those different faucets. You have your debt, you have the gold standard, you got everything that's going on in Iraq, you got the central banking system, with the trade deals and everything else, the slowdown of a global economy, and how it's just pushing and pushing and just putting pressure and pressure on this central banking system that has not been for the people of this world. So if it's going to get worse, then we just watch and we see what happens. But keep in mind, folks, that there are people literally out there putting their lives on the line that eventually will push this global currency reset, or what they're calling the global monetary reset, let you know that it is coming, but they can't officially tell you that it is coming. So eventually, with all that pressure, at some point, people, this thing is going to break. And that's why there is no date and there is no rate. People are still asking about that. People or say, well, you don't have any facts, or nobody has any facts about how things can happen. We just present you guys with the news, and you can see that it's coming. And just like Kim Clement said, sudden change. Just like a lot of people who have dreams and visions are going to wake up and there's the sudden change. When is that going to happen? We don't know. We're still waiting on a prime minister for Iraq, and I think that's very important. But I thank you guys for listening. If you guys like my videos, please go down to the description or wait to the end of the video to check out the link to the Patreon. And with that being said, Twisted Christian out.